Hello. Okay, so first I want to apologize for dressing in white, because yesterday I was talking to Ella and we were saying how white might be too much in your face, but the thing is, all of my other clothes need ironing, and I couldn't borrow an iron from the hotel because, well, they said for security reasons. So I literally washed this today and used the air dryer, the blow dryer, to dry it off for 3 hours. Yeah, sorry about that, if it's too much in your face. So as Fabio mentioned, this is going to be a slightly sort of longer talk. But I've divided this talk so that it's made up of multiple totally independent sections. So even if we cannot finish everything with the time that we have, it would, yeah, like, you could still read everything in the slides when I give the links to them. So the talk is called CSS and SVG in real life. Initially, it was called SVG in real life, but then I'm currently working with the Smashing Magazine team to build the new Smashing Magazine, as you're gonna know it, and I think it's starting next week. I've learned so much in the process, and I've had to use some really interesting techniques and some hacks. Most of them were CSS instead of SVG, and I thought that it would be fantastic if I could share them with you, and so that's what I'm going to be doing here. So this is CSS and SVG in real life, and more particularly in the new Smashing Magazine. But these are not just for Smashing Magazine. These are all practical tips that you can apply everywhere. I'm going to try to go as slowly as possible for them. OK, so I'm going to dig right in. I'm going to start with iconography. The first section is the SVG section. So as you might expect, we used SVG for all of the icons on the magazine, which is actually no surprise. However, there are some illustrations that would initially make more sense to be as SVG, to be embedded as SVG, but I didn't embed them as SVG. An example is these small drop caps that you're going to see at the beginning of every article. So you have this letter and you have this cute little illustration. There's a bunch of them, and a lot of them contain these small details, like a lot of complex paths, a lot of small details. And the thing is, when an SVG image contains a lot of, for example, effects, shadows, linear gradients, a lot of paths and paths made up of data and data, increase the file size of the SVG, you're going to end up with an SVG that is too big to be used. So even when an image makes more sense or is a great candidate for SVG, you should also look to see if SVG is a great candidate for the image as well. So it should go both ways. If the file size of the SVG is too big, you're generally better off using a PNG or a high-resolution PNG of the image instead, because in those cases, usually always optimize both the SVG and the PNG and compare the sizes. And in a lot of cases, you're going to end up with smaller file size for the PNG. So you should definitely use PNG for that. If you do, you can use the new responsive images the source set attribute in order to provide multiple versions of the image for the different screen resolutions. So you have a 1x, 2x, 3x, maybe even 4x someday. So if you cannot use SVG, that does not mean that you cannot provide a high resolution or a crisp image. You can definitely do that. And you can take it even further with responsive images. If you do have an SVG and you can serve it using an image tag, if it's just an image, you can provide the fallback as a PNG using also HTML5 responsive images. You can read all about that in this article here. But if you're not embedding the SVG as an image, if you need more of it, the fallback technique is going to change. And this brings up the most frequently asked question that I usually get. Which embedding technique is the best one? Which one should you choose? So we have 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, actually 6 if you count in embed, which nobody uses anymore, and 7 if you count in the picture element. So you have all of these different ways to embed an SVG. Which one should you choose? A while back, Vitaly Friedman, he was asking me a few questions. Literally, the answer to each and every one of them was, it depends. Because each and every one of these techniques has its pros and cons, especially when it comes to animation. Sometimes you can animate, sometimes you can't animate, sometimes you can use a specific technique to do that, CSS, JavaScript, SMIL, sometimes you cannot. So the answer to almost all of the questions that I get when it comes to SVG is a big old it depends. And it depends on what? It depends on many factors. And these factors depend on you and your project. What does your project need? What do you need? What are you trying to do? What do you expect the SVG to be able to do? So once you decide that SVG is the image format that you're going to use, if it's better for performance, if the image is better for SVG and SVG is better for the image, I usually ask myself a lot of questions, and depending on the answer to these questions, I decide on which embedding technique to use. And sometimes, most of the times, there are compromises to be made, but it doesn't have to be always. So some of the questions that I ask myself is the icon just decoration? If yes, then embed it as a background image. Most likely it's going to be a background image because I don't need it to be in the DOM. It's just decoration. I don't need to animate it most of the time. Background image is the ideal way to do it this way. Even you can take it even further and inline it in the CSS so you don't have to request an extra, if you have an extra HTTP request. Does the icon need to have a smooth animation, a smooth transition? Does it need to have that transition? Can you compromise losing it or not? What kind of fallback suits this particular SVG image that you have? For example, certain types of images are better off if you provide a text fallback, such as infographics. So an infographic is basically a set of data that you're representing in a specific visual manner. And if the SVG is not supported in that case, the sensible thing to do is to provide that data for the user in order to consume it. Because otherwise, if you use a PNG in that case, or a JPEG as a fallback, if the screen resolution is too big for the JPEG, you're going to end up with something that looks blurry or is unreadable. The text is inside of an image is not readable, it's not selectable, it's not searchable, it's not accessible. So you're going to lose all of that. But if you provide the text as fallback, and I actually did that in one of my client projects, so the information inside of the infographic was essential. Basically, it was the meat of that page. And we needed the user, for example, IE that doesn't support SVG, we wanted them to read the text, be able to select it, maybe share it, whatever. Using an image for that wasn't sensible. So sometimes you need to provide text, for example. In that case, using object is the best way, because you get to provide the text fallback between the opening and closing object tags. What is best for performance? Again, always ask yourself this question. Do not compromise performance at any cost. If inlining is best, if for any reason you end up with, depending on these answers, you end up with inlining is best, how does that affect the markup? Because even though inlining is actually the best, I am going to go as far as saying, okay, inlining is the best way to get all of the flexibility and all of the benefits of SVG. But sometimes it doesn't make sense to inline SVG, even when it's the best way. So for example, in the magazine, we're going to have, there are going to be 3 membership plans. You're going to be able to subscribe to the magazine, and basically there are 3 membership plans. Each of those plans has, we're going to have a pricing table or pricing cards, and each card contains one of these illustrations. Now, the text inside of these images replaces a heading. So each card, we don't have a heading that actually says, this membership is called supporter, or this membership is called the membered membership, or I feel smashing membership. The text inside of the image needs to be actual text. It needs to be readable. So in this case here, at first I thought, okay, the illustrations might be a little too complex to be used as SVG, but then after comparing PNG and SVG, the file size was almost pretty much the same, so I went with SVG. And the second reason why it was the reason why I said, okay, I cannot use anything other than SVG, is that the text it needs to be actual text. We don't have any other heading. Now, you could have maybe worked around that using putting a heading in the DOM, for example, and hiding it and showing the image instead. But if you're looking for, okay, a screen reader will be able to read that text, but if you want to select the text, you won't be able to do that if it's not actual text. So that's why I said we should use SVG. And since the text is also using the Miha font face, which we're using on the magazine, you have to apply that font face to the text. And the best way to do that with SVG is if the SVG is inline in the DOM, because then you can just apply the font face just like you would apply it to a paragraph in HTML. If the image is not embedded inline, and if it's, for example, in an image tag, you're going to have to go inside of that SVG and define the font faces inside of the SVG and reference them there. So not only is the SVG, you're going to have an extra HTTP request for the SVG, but each SVG is going to be requesting the fonts and applying them. So that's 3 times. The best way is to inline it, but it's not easy to inline an SVG when it looks like this. This is the minified version. And I have 3 of these, and there was no way I was going to put these in the DOM. So I still wanted the text to be inline inside of the HTML, but I didn't want the image to do it, to be inline as well. So I thought, why don't I separate the text from the artwork inside of the image? And if I can, if the image, the actual illustration is external, but the text is inline, then it should totally work. And I actually did that on the way to Freiburg in the plane. I was sitting there with the headphones in my ears, and there were two guys sitting in front next to me, and I was so excited that it worked. I started doing these silly moves, and they were looking at me like, what is wrong with her? It was so nice. I feel so proud of this. So what I did is, I got the no text SVGs. I removed the text from the initial SVGs, and then I referenced them. One of the best features about SVG is that it is also a document format. It's not just an image. So you can reference an image inside of that document, an image inside of an image. So what I did is, I used an SVG inline in the page. That's the image that I want. Inside of it, I'm using the image element to reference the illustration, the artwork, without the text. And then I add the text using the text tag, which is going to be real text. Searchable, selectable, accessible, indexable, everything you would want from actual HTML text. It's not HTML text, but it's exactly like that. You specify the X and Y, font size if you want to, positioned it so that it's inside of these signs here. And I was done, basically. You go to the CSS, you apply the font family that you want, fill color, you don't use color in SVG, you use fill color instead, font weight, bold, anything else you want. You get the benefits of both. You get the image is going to be cached, the DOM is clean, the text is accessible, and I got everything that I wanted. So the point from this section here is, sometimes, depending on a lot of factors, you will have to choose one of the different embedding techniques that we have. But what I'm trying to tell you here is that you don't have to really choose one embedding technique. I embedded the SVG in two different ways here, inline and external at the same time, and both of them inside of the SVG. So sometimes you can get just a little bit creative and get the best out of SVG without any compromises. Before I finish the SVG section, the article figures on the magazine have this caption that includes a small camera icon. I could have embedded that icon in two different ways because it's just decoration, either as a background image or inline, but not in the DOM, for example. You could use a pseudo element and insert that, because I didn't want it to be in the DOM because I didn't want them, the magazine, the content creators, to have to add it every single time. They shouldn't have to worry about this. Background image and pseudo element is pretty much the same. I can't think of a difference between these two. I don't know why I choose pseudo element, but I did. The icon, if the icon was a background image, so one of the questions that I usually get is icon fonts can scale up and down with the text. If I change the font size, the icon from the font is going to change size as well. Can I do that with SVG? And the answer is yes. If you use font relative units, specifically M, if you specify the width and the height, the dimensions of the SVG using M units, you can scale it up and down with the font as you would expect with icon fonts. So in this case here, I had a pseudo element. It was in line with the text. Is it the mouse here? Nope, it's lost on my screen. OK, here it is. So we have the height and the width set in M's, and margin right, so basically like all the cool kids do, everything you can set using M's, you set it using M, so that as soon as the font size changes up and down, the icon is going to change and scale with it as well. Another question I get is an icon font can inherit the text color. So if I change the text color, I don't have to go to the icon and specifically change that as well. Can CSS do that? Can SVG do that too? Yes, definitely. If you use the current color variable. So basically, in this example here, I just have icon fonts are generally very simple icons, and an example of that is the Twitter icon. And if you create a Twitter icon using SVG, it's just one path inside of the SVG. So that's why I'm using that example. So we have an SVG. Inside of it, we have a path, which is the actual icon. If you set the fill color on the icon to be current color, and you set the color on the SVG to inherit, no matter how much you change, no matter the value that you give to the font, it's going to be the same, or to the text, it's going to be the same inside of the SVG. The SVG is going to inherit the color from the text, and fill on the path is going to use that current color, whatever color has been inherited. This is just the simplest example of inheritance, of color inheritance in SVG. Now, if you have multicolored icons and you want to create different themes of that icon, for example, change more than just one color, it gets a little bit more complex. You can do that. You start getting into shadow DOM and CSS variables, and that's outside the scope of this talk. So you can read all about that in this article. That was the SVG section. The rest is CSS, but it's quite interesting, I hope. Now, there were a few interesting design challenges and requirements when I was working on the magazine. Most of those were typographic related. So one of the things that we needed is the ability to set fluid and adaptive font size that changes as the viewport changes. Basically, that's what we required. And this is one of the things that it is one of the most needed and requested features in CSS. So we needed, usually, when we talked about, like a couple of years ago, when we talked about having headings that scale up and down with a viewport, we used to talk about using plugins such as Big Text, Big Text maybe is it called, or Fit Text, or something like that. And honestly speaking, using JavaScript to do that is totally overkill. So ideally, we would be able to scale the font size as the viewport scales using nothing but CSS. And thankfully, we can do that. Using viewport units, VH, VW, Vmin, and Vmax, you can use this unit in order to tell the browser to size whatever you want, whether it's a font size, a width, and a height, size that relative to the viewport. Now, viewport percentage lengths are relative to the size of the initial containing block, which is the viewport. It is, generally speaking, not always, the visible part of the document inside of the browser. I'm going to get to the not always part shortly. When the height or the width of the viewport is changed, they should be scaled accordingly. One viewport height unit, for example, VH, is equal to 1/100, or 1% of the height of the viewport. Same for the width. Now, combine this feature with font size, set the font size relative to the viewport, and you get what you need. For example, here, I have the scalable heading. I've set the font size to be 10 viewport width, which is 10% of the viewport width. As the viewport size increases or decreases, the size of the heading decreases and increases as well. Now, you may have noticed in this video, I think, yeah, it's still there. This technique does have one unwanted and really bad side effect, in that the text keeps scaling up, which may not be that big of a deal, but it keeps scaling down so that it becomes practically unreadable. So imagine if you're viewing that page on a small watch, for example, or even on a small iPhone 5 screen, and you have 10% of the viewport width to be the font size, it's actually too small to be read. So ideally, we'd be able to set a minimum font size and maybe even a maximum font size, and have the browser scale the text as the viewport scales up and down. But once it reaches that range, like once it reaches the minimum size that you want, or the maximum size, it should just stop there. Mike Riethmuller, he's an Australian web developer, he came up with this brilliant technique where well, this is it. You use both pixels and viewport units at the same time. So what we're doing here, what we're essentially doing is we're telling the browser that the font size is 16 pixels, and then you add to it 3% of the viewport width. As the viewport width increases, the font size is going to increase, but no matter how much it decreases, it's not going to go below 16 pixels because it starts at 16 pixels. This is how you get the minimum font size, because we don't have a min font size property in CSS yet. You can take it even further and set a maximum font size by specifying a range, the range, within the calc function. Did I define calc? No, I didn't. OK. So the formula is a little bit more complex in that case, but it's certainly not difficult. It took me like 4 or 5 times of looking at this and copying, like, or more, oh, not this. OK. This is what Mike says before I show you the formula. It appears that by using calc and viewport width, we can get responsive typography that scales perfectly between specific pixel values within a specific viewport range. This means that you can have perfect smooth scaling between any 2 font sizes over any viewport range. The fonts will start scaling and stop scaling exactly where you want. And this is the formula. Minimum font size plus maximum font size minus minimum font size times 100 viewport width minus minimum screen size where you want the scaling to stop, divided by maximum screen size where you want the scaling up to stop, minus minimum screen size. I have no idea how he came up with this. It took me literally like for 5 or 6 times maybe, I kept looking at this formula. Like I knew that I want, for example, a heading, a specific heading. I want to limit the size of the heading between 25 pixels and 35 pixels. So I would just go to this formula and just put 25 where the 16 is and 35 where the 24 is. And we did have in the magazine, we have these 2 screen sizes where most of the changes take place. And like some media queries, generally speaking, media queries should be content-based. So a lot of elements or components are going to have media queries that are totally different from the rest of the page, depending on whether they need to be like that. So if the element starts looking bad on a different screen size or a different viewport size, you should totally set a breakpoint there. Okay? So this is the formula. We use that for the general font size on the body element. I also use that for different elements that needed to have different font size ranges. And it works. Now, Mike has an article about this. I think, well, this is a code pen where he explains it. There's also a table, and everything basically shows you. When you have the table, you get a more visual way of telling where you want the range to be. Calc support and viewport unit support is really good. You can provide a fallback. If you're using, for example, font size calc something, you can provide the fallback by saying font size 16, which is the default, and then override it with font size calc whatever you want to do. And this is the article where Mike explains everything about this technique on Smashy Magazine. Now, using the same approach, you can also provide a vertical rhythm on a page. So as the width of the line increases, you need to increase the vertical space between these lines, otherwise it's going to be very hard to read. So you can use also the same technique in order to change the range of the line height. So if you shrink the line height should be smaller, and then if you extend it, it should be larger. So it's exactly the same thing, except, well, it also has the same word calculations here, but except more parentheses for some reason. This technique was written, Tim Brown wrote about this technique on the Adobe Typekit blog, so it's basically the same principle. We're also using that. I actually ditched it, but I didn't tell Vitaly that I did. Because in some cases the line height got too big, and it's a pain in the neck to work with. At least I know I haven't dug into it really well, I have to admit that. He explains a little bit how he came up with that formula, but then this article here explains the mathematics like really good. If you really want to understand every single piece of that formula, read this article here. That's scalable typography. And the next challenge that I had was text underlines. So generally speaking, when you have an underline, text underline in CSS, the line is going to overlap the descendants of the font, of the text. So if you have a G, for example, the line is going to cross that G. And it doesn't really look that good, but it doesn't really look particularly bad. However, in the design was obvious that the G should not be overlapped by the line, neither should the Y. All of the descendants should be cleared. Now, there is no standard way in CSS to do that. There is no implemented standard way to do that, because there is a new property, which I'm going to show you next. So I had to find a way to do this. So it all started, this whole idea of clearing the descendants, started with this article on Medium by Marcin Witchery. Okay? So he said that the ideal underlines would have these properties. We should be able to change the width of the line. We should be able to change the distance from the text if you want it to be up more or push it down. Change the distance from the text, change the color. Maybe if you want the text to be black, but the underline to be blue. We do have in the magazine as well. We should be able to clear the descendants. We don't want any overlaps. And perhaps have a separate style for visited links as well. Now, we don't have any way to do that in CSS yet. There's this article, it's called CSS Underlines Suck, which they do. This article summarizes all of the current techniques that we can create this effect, or more like hack our way to that effect using different CSS techniques. The author does an excellent job showing the different alternative approaches. He has a mention of, I think there was bottom border, which it wouldn't be able to clear that because it's a border. There's a technique using pseudo elements, maybe even HTML5 canvas, which in my opinion is total overkill. And then there's also the text decoration skip property, which is the standard way to do this. Now, using text decoration skip, we should be able to tell I think the value is text decoration skip. I forgot the value. So basically, you tell the browser to just skip the descenders, don't overlap them. It's not supported in any browser yet, so I couldn't even use that as an enhancement. So I would have totally used it, and if a browser does not support it, they would still get the cross effect, but it's not supported anywhere. So there was this one technique that suited our needs for the magazine quite well, and that technique uses text shadow and linear gradients. And this is, first I'm going to show you a visual explanation of that, how it works. This demo is from that article. So this is how you fake the idea that the line is actually not crossing the text, but it actually is. So what do we have here? We have the background, green, whatever background we have behind the text. Then we have a line. That line is actually a linear gradient background. The linear gradient background has been shrunk into one line by giving it a size 100% by 1 pixels. So if you want the border to be thicker, you could be 100% by 2 pixels or 3 pixels. Okay? Background, linear gradient, text shadow, which has the same color as the background, and then we have the actual text. And this is what we get here. Green, green, text shadow. And because the text shadow is sort of above the background, it's part of the foreground, not the background, we get this thing here. So the text has this sort of halo effect around it. Okay, and it makes it look like it's not being overlapped by the line. Does it make sense? Okay, cool. Thank you. You spared me some more speaking. Okay, this works. It was pretty much everything that I needed for the magazine, and it works brilliantly. So for the main links on the page, which are blue links on a white background, the code looks like this. The linear gradient, which represents the underline, gets the blue color of the text. Linear gradient, blue, blue. The color is also blue. You set the background size, background repeat. We don't want it to repeat. And then we set the text shadow to white, which is the same as the color of the background. Now, if you want to even make this better, instead of repeating the same blue color inside the linear gradient, we use current color. So no matter what color you use on the text, the line is going to inherit that color as well. But it gets a little bit more complex when two things happen. First of all, if you have a background image, not a solid background color, it won't work because the text shadow has to be the same color as the background color. And if you have an image, you cannot set the image to that. Now, someone at Smashing Conference suggested using blend modes, but I can't even imagine how that would work. If someone has an idea, I would be totally interested in seeing if it will work. Now, it also gets a little bit more complex when you have multiple variations on the same page. So we have different text colors, different underline colors, different text on different background colors. Now, in this case, remember how we said that the text shadow needs to be the same color as the background? So you would have to repeat or change the text shadow for every one of those occurrences. And in this case, Sass is a lifesaver. So what I ended up doing, thanks to a tip from Hugo, I don't even know how to pronounce your last name, Hugo, sorry. Sorry? Don't, okay. So he suggested using a mixin. I took the mixin a little bit further. I don't usually use Sass for more than nesting and variables, so it felt like I did like some genius thing by adding those values basically in those parentheses. Okay, so you will be able to specify the shadow color, the border color, and the border width that you want, and then all you have to do is call that mixin wherever you want to apply that underline. And so I'm using this mixin and other mixins. So since I have multiple text colors on different background colors variations, so I have, for example, white on red link, gray on navy link. Of course, you would use better naming, but naming sucks. And inside of these, you specify the color of the text, and then you create an underline using the previous mixin, and you give that underline whatever color that you want. It works. Luckily, on the magazine, we don't have anywhere text on images, so we were totally able to use this, and it works. Apparently, after doing some research for this talk, I found out that, I think this is Compass, I'm not really sure, but there is already a mixin called underline somewhere, which enables you to have more parameters than what I have specified for the magazine. So you can totally check it out and use it if you want. Of course, my friend said that I'm obsessed about this. I didn't even know until he mentioned it. So I always have to add this, change the selection color when you select the text. So for the magazine, I set it to red, which is the color of the magazine. And the text has to be white because it looks better that way. And since the text shadow is by default, is white by default, so we get this result here on the top right. So the point here is, what I'm trying to say is, if you do use this technique, remove the text shadow when it causes any problems. Always make sure that you test all the different scenarios that you could end up with, or the user could end up with. The next challenge was nested links. Now, one of the requirements we had was the ability to have an item in a grid be fully clickable, and yet still have independently clickable elements inside of that element. More specifically, this is what we have. We have a grid of articles. Each article is clickable as the whole entity, as a whole, and would link to the article page. But we still wanted and needed the links such as the author name and any links inside of the text to also be clickable as regular links. So they might link somewhere else, not to the article page. But the problem is in HTML, you cannot put a link inside of another link. That's illegal. So according to the specification, an A element cannot contain any interactive element. And since an A element is an interactive element, you cannot put an A element inside of an A element. You just can't. Okay. But this is what we did for the magazine. If you look at the hashtag, it's almost cut off at the bottom. So if you hover over anywhere on the article, you get the link to the article. If you hover over the author, it links to the author, and then a different link. So we did that, but there are, I'm not really sure if there are 2 or 3. One of them relies on the DOM and the other 2 don't. Okay. So this is what we needed. And if you try to do this in HTML, if you try to have, even Sublime Text didn't really color highlight it well because it's illegal. So you have a link inside of a link. The way the browser renders it is this. It closes the first link before it starts the second one. And so you end up with, instead of parent and another child being the same link, you end up with parent is one link, child is another link, another child is just something external. Doesn't work anymore. Doesn't link anywhere. And this is not what we needed. Now, I think it was Roman Komarov. He came up with this technique. So he was faced with the same challenge. He wanted a link inside of another link. So he found a way to work around the browser and also leverage the default behavior of the browser. So what he did is he wrapped the internal link in an object element, and he gave that object element a random type. I think he used a better type than what I'm using here. He was like lol no or lol whatever. So what happens here? This works. If you put the internal link inside of an object and then you put that inside of the external link, they're rendered as 2 separate links, one link inside of another link. Because of the way browsers handle the object elements, the object container is going to be completely ignored if you give it a type that is invalid, allowing the content inside of it. Remember how I mentioned earlier that you can use the object element to provide text fallback for an SVG? Because everything you put inside between the opening and closing tags of the object is going to be rendered as a fallback if the object fails to load. And since the object here has an invalid type, it's going to fail, and so the browser is going to render whatever goes inside of it. According to the way Roman explains it, is after wrapping any HTML with such attribute-less object, we would get just a wrapper element for this content, which is the inner element. But a wrapper with an unusual trait, any content inside of it would be treated by the browser's parser without looking at the object's context. So it wouldn't even see or look into the external A tag. So using this trait, we can finally nest one link into another, separating them for a parser. So we're sort of mocking the browser here and taking advantage of the way it handles HTML. It's just going to handle it's going to render the internal A as a fallback without looking at the context of the object, which is the external A. And it works. He wrote about all of this logic in his article here. Now, this technique certainly works, but for our use case, it was completely impractical because we shouldn't have to set up a script whose sole purpose is to find all of the links inside of those excerpts and wrap them in an object. I mean, we could do that, but we didn't want to do that. And I don't know what performance effects it would have. So it would have to go over each one of those, find every link, and then wrap it in an object tag. So we wanted something different. Now, a while back when Vitaly tweeted about links inside of other links, Harry Roberts shared this link to this JS Fiddle. So he has a different way of doing it. Without touching the DOM, he has a paragraph of text that contains two or three links. And at the end of it, we have the read more link, which is for our example. For example, most text excerpts would have a read more link. So what Harry is doing here, he's essentially taking the last link, he is making it expanding or extending it visually only so that it has the same width and height as the entire paragraph, entire container, okay? Giving it a Z index, but the Z index is actually, it's not pulling it up. I should have said it the other way around. So you're extending the last link, making it as wide or as big as the container, whatever that container is, which in our case is a grid item. And then you're taking the other links, because in CSS, the last element in the DOM is going to have the higher Z index, and you don't want that in this case. So he's pushing the last link below the rest of them by giving the other ones position relative and then Z index 1. I'll show another example. Now, Harry's idea is brilliant because it does not require any HTML elements to be added in the DOM. All you have to do is use CSS to expand one link and then bring the other links on top of it. So wherever you click on the grid, you will be actually clicking that last link, which is the read more link. And if you want to click on those individual links, you can still totally do that because you've pulled them on top of that. It works. I think it's brilliant, but it does come with a problem. I couldn't use that because of that. So basically, this is what you get when it comes to the tabbing order. So imagine if you have a grid of articles like the one we have in the magazine, and you want to tab through the grid, okay, using keyboard. You would expect the behavior to be tab the entire first element, and then tab the internal links, and then tab the second element, and then tab through the internal links, and third, etc. But with Harry's technique, this is what we get. This is the order. Internal, 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 overall. Internal, internal. This is the order that you get for a grid. Internal, 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 overall, internal, 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 overall. That doesn't make sense, at least not to me. So I didn't use that because it doesn't make sense. I already said that. So in Harry's technique, he used the last link in the article, in whatever, let's call it article, because it's an article in our case. Now, I tried looking for other techniques, and all of those techniques use the exact same principle. You have a link inside of the excerpt, whether maybe it's at the beginning of the excerpt or at the end of it, and you're extending that link. And I couldn't guarantee having a link, because maybe there is no link. And again, I didn't want to have to include a script that would insert a link whose sole purpose is, being able to click on the entire element. I didn't want them to have to touch the DOM or add any script for that. So what I did is I thought, okay, the principle here is to take one of the links that you have and extend it, okay, to be the same height and width at the of the element, and then raise the other links on top of it. So why not just use the title of the article? It's there. And when you click anywhere, hover anywhere on the element, you want it to take you to the article page, and the title already takes you to the article page. And that works. So what I did is, the article title contains a link, obviously. Now, the link inside of it contains a pseudo element. So the way I extended the title was by adding a pseudo element, which is part of the title. And that pseudo element is positioned absolutely relative to the entire item. It has the width and the height of the item. It's 100% width. There's a little bit more calculation in the width and the height because it's specific to the layout and the grid of the magazine. So it's not, you don't really need calc in this case. Extend the title and it works. And then for the rest of the links, the excerpts and the author name, give them position relative at Z index 1. You need position relative because Z index doesn't work on any element unless it has a position other than static. So it has to be fixed or relative. And when it comes to the tab order, this is what you get. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. We're skipping that thing where you internal, 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 overall, internal, internal, over. This is the tab order that you would normally expect. And that's how I did it. I wasn't expecting that. Thanks. Okay, the next challenge was multi-line padded text. So if you have a piece of text and you are breaking it onto multiple lines, if you want to apply a padding to that text, wherever the line breaks, this is an image from an article on CSS Tricks that I'm going to link to here next, so you can find it here. So when the line breaks, where the edges where the line actually breaks, you lose the padding. You only get the padding at the beginning of the text and at the end of the text. But for a nice visual effect, you should be able to specify the padding that would go everywhere the line breaks. Chris Coyer did a wrap-up of all of the different hacks that we can use today to do that. Some of them use box shadows, some of them use pseudo elements. They're too complicated. And what I try usually to do is to go for a solution that's as pure as possible. No hacks. And if I can find a standard solution that would work, for example, in, like, say, 70% of the browsers, I would totally use that and let the non-supporting browsers get the default fallback, which is not really that bad, because that's always better and clearer than having to use a hack. Now, there is a standard way to do this. In CSS, we have this box decoration break property. What box decoration break does is it specifies whether the box's margins, borders, and padding and other decorations wrap the broken edges of the box fragments. So do you want them to be applied to the edges or not? This is exactly what I needed. Using box decoration break, the value clone, you get that result. So what I have here is I'm going to show you what this is the featured article heading. So we have this heading on the magazine on the home page. It breaks onto two lines, and we just wanted to add this nice little padding on both sides of it. This is what the code looks like. You specify everything as you would normally do, and then you add box decoration break clone, and you get the padding on the broken edges. Now, one thing with box decoration break is that it only works on inline elements. So you would have to add a span inside of the H1 or H2 and apply box decoration break to that. Okay, mission accomplished. Box decoration break support is really good, I would say really good. The only browser that does not support it, unsurprisingly, is IE and Edge. So I use the property as an enhancement because, as Jeremy would say, do websites need to look exactly the same in every browser? No. So if a browser does not support, I think this is a video, actually. It should be a video. Yep. So if a browser does not support that property, it's going to get this here with, oh, stop playing. So without, there's not a big difference, so it is still visually acceptable, and it's used as an enhancement, no hacks necessary. Custom list bullets. Now, Mark mentioned CSS counters in his talk, and this is exactly what we're going to be using here, and I just spoiled this entire section. So in CSS, you can specify the bullets of a list, an ordered list, or an unordered list using the list style type property. Now, the list style type sets the appearance of list markers. They're called list markers if the value of the list style image is not valid or if it doesn't display. A list marker can have one of three types. This is useless here. So these are all the default list bullets that we have or can set in CSS. But what we have in the design is this. Unordered lists have this rounded rectangle, and ordered lists have these numbers. Okay, rounded rectangles are easy to set. You can use list style image and reference that bullet image, which is definitely an SVG, and put it there. But for the counter, for the numbers, it was a little bit more difficult because if you go back to this, the second column, second row, 01 dot, 02 dot, 03 dot. So we do have that numbering system, but the problem with the default system is that you get a dot after each number, but the design doesn't have a dot. By the way, Daniel Moll designed this. He's giving the last talk today. So Dan didn't really include a dot. So I was like, okay, I cannot use that default CSS style. And that's when I knew that I had to use CSS counters. Now, basically, CSS counters, allows you to number a list of elements of any type. Like Mark mentioned, it can be headings, it can be list items, figures in an article. Numbers are then incremented per element, so whenever you have a new element, the number is incremented. Using the corresponding CSS property, you can initialize a counter and then use it and increment it wherever you want. So an example is you can use them, they're pretty useful for figures, automatic figure numbering. When I used to, I think it was so if you're writing in HTML and the result of what you're writing is going to be printed, going to a printer, in books, usually we have these automatic numbering for figures. So what I used to do before I was introduced to CSS counters was whenever an image was changed or removed or added, I would have to go over all of them again, or most of them, to just change the numbers, because I didn't use CSS counters. If you use CSS counters, then no matter how many elements change in the list or in the collection that you have. You don't have to fix anything manually. They're also useful for article headings, heading number 1, section 1.1, 1.2, section 2, 2.1, 2.3, etc. Counters are created and controlled using two properties, counter reset and counter increment. I hate the name counter reset because counter reset is used to set a counter. It's also used to reset, but it should just be called counter set, maybe. So what we're doing for the ordered list that we have, we're defining a counter on the ordered list, counter reset, we're giving it a name list counter. And then for every li, we're telling the browser we're going to increment the list counter that we defined earlier. Okay, so it gets a value, it becomes 1, it becomes 2, 3, 4. And then we're using that value, we're not displaying it yet, we're using that value as a value or as content for the pseudo element on the list item. So every list item contains a before pseudo element, and the content of that pseudo element is the actual number that we have, the counter in our case. So content, property, counter, which counter that we have, and then we specify the type of the counter. In this case, it's decimal leading 0, 0, 1, 0, 2, 0, 3. And the best thing about this is, if you want to add that dot, you can append it, you can do that, but since we don't want it, we don't do it. And we get the results that we want. So all of this here, just because I wanted to get rid of that dot. And CSS counters are incredibly useful for this. You can read all about them in this entry or using CSS counters on MDN. Layout. Okay. So we had this layout here. This is the article layout in the New Smashing magazine. So we have author. This is just a prototype, by the way, not real content. That's why I'm up there. So we have author, bio, article title and tags, summary and ads, and then you get the content there. So the challenge here was, the order of the element in the DOM needs to be logical and cannot be changed to accommodate the visual layout. And the content of the article in the DOM, the actual content here, cannot be interrupted by any elements, such as divs for presentation-only purposes. Okay? So you start with HTML, you get it ready, and then you just don't touch it anymore. Don't touch the HTML just because you want to achieve something visually. Okay? My first thing I did was I divided these sections into 3 sections. Section number 1, which is the author and the title. Section number 2, which is the summary and the ad. And section number 3, which is the rest of the article. So my attempt to create this layout was float section number 1 to the right, float section number 2 to the right, but give it a different width. Don't float section number 3, because if you don't float it, it's just going to wrap around those 2 sections normally. But if it wraps around these sections, it's going to wrap all the way up, so all the way next to the author image, and that's not what we want. So in order to push the text a little bit down, you could add a padding or a margin, and you would get this result. However, when I did that, okay, I got the results that I wanted. We have a drop caps, we have the text. It's up there. I can push it down. It works. Cool. But then you have to float the drop caps, because it has to be floated. And as soon as I floated the drop caps, I got this. The layout broke. And okay, I have a float that's breaking my layout, so I need to clear the floats. You can either use the clear property, you can tell the browser clear the left, which is useless in this case, or you can tell it clear right, but that's not what we want, because if we say clear right, we're going to push the content all the way down below section number 2, below the summary, because you're literally clearing the right. I don't want anything on the right of that content. That's also not what we wanted. So I was only left with overflow hidden. Okay, that works. So I got this. That's as close as I could get. The next thing that I wanted to do was to pull the content up a little bit because it needed to be on the same level as the article title. I couldn't do that. Using margin top something negative, like to pull it up, didn't work. Yeah, it didn't work. So I asked Leah Veru if she knew something, if she knew. I tried for a whole day. I tried all the different techniques that I could think of. I just couldn't get the layout that I wanted without breaking it. So I talked to Leah. Leah also didn't come up with a standard way because we were looking for a clean solution. And she actually said every time design needs to be changed, I thought we were going to have to change the layout. Because CSS is SHIT, a kitten dies somewhere. So I told Dan that we might have to change the design. luckily, Dan doesn't take no for an answer. Apparently, he had this hacky way of doing it. This is how it's done. OK, so I have section number 1 in red, section number 2, the summary and add in yellow, section number 3 in, I think it's blue. So this is how it's done. Float section number 1 to the right. Float section number 2 to the right, same steps. You don't need to float section number 3, but it's useful to float it to the left. And then go back to section number 1, give it a negative padding so that you pull the content underneath it up. Ew. And then we push section number 2 back down by giving it an upper positive margin. But we're not going to push section number 2 up because that's the lever where we want it to be. So in order to get rid of this overlap here, Dan uses a pseudo element. Before, we create a pseudo element. We give it display block. It has to be display block, otherwise you wouldn't be able to give it height and width. Content is nothing because we don't want a content. We give it a background color just here because I want you to be able to visualize it, to see it. OK, you give it a width and the height. The width and the height depend on the area that you want to clear. OK, so the height in this case is equal to the margin that you gave the yellow section here. OK, and then you float it to the right. And this is what you get. Now, I go up back to the content. I'm going to add a few more paragraphs just so that you can see how the text, I was shocked here, just so that you can see how the text is going to flow. Faster, faster, faster. That's CodePen loading because my connection is really fast in Lebanon. OK, now I'm going to remove the colors from the pseudo element and the content area, and you can see how it flows. And this is exactly what we wanted. This is the result. This is the layout, using a pseudo element hack and negative margin. I would have never, ever thought of that. And when I first saw the CodePen, that's before I even chatted to Dan, I just saw a CodePen. He said, hey, look, it works. Look at that code. This is how I felt. I hated every bit of it. Every bit of it. And I was trying to convince Vitaly not to use it or convince Dan not to use it because I want a clean solution. But then we jumped on a call with Dan, and it took him less than 30 minutes to change my feelings from this to this. It's a fantastic technique. It works everywhere. It's a hack, but it's easy to document, fairly easy to document, and it just works. So why not use it? So to recap the steps, actually, no, there's no don't. Float section number 1, float section number 2 to the right, 3 to the left, pull 2 and 3 up by negative margin, push 2 down by positive margin, create pseudo elements inside of 3, and float it so that it clears the overlap. Actually, Vitaly loves dirty hacks, and the whole idea of, like, we're using a hack that you wouldn't actually find in a lot of places online was so appealing to him. OK. I'm going to go over like maybe a couple of sections really fast now. OK. So pull out components. Now, you may have come across this pattern before where you have a long article, and then somewhere in the middle of the article, you have a component on desktop. You have a component that is part of a sidebar, but it's not really, like, it's not stacked. Like, there are multiple elements on the article in the sidebar, but there's a lot of space between them. So what we have in the magazine is inside of the article on mobile, when we have only one column, we have the smashing job board and a few other components. And the way we want them to behave on desktop is we want them to be part of a sidebar. The DOM doesn't contain any sidebar, so it's only visual here. The important part here is that as soon as you remove it from the main column, the rest of the content needs to go where it was in the beginning, okay? Where the component was. So it shouldn't leave any white space behind. So the requirements were pull the component out of the article's content flow, make it fit to the sidebar, you give it a specific width, make the component, the element, the content that comes after the component flow where the component was flowing, and make the component styles independent. The last line, what does it mean? So usually when we talk about removing an element from page flow, the first thing that we think of maybe is using absolute positioning, because when you use position absolute, you're essentially removing the content from the page flow and positioning it anywhere you want. But if you use position absolute, you're going to have to create a positioning context for that element. So you're going to have to go to the article container and set position relative there so that you can position the container relative to that content, so that you can position the component relative to that container. Ideally, we don't even have to do that. Like, what I wanted to do was to be able to specify a set of styles. I'm seeing everyone. I'm hot here too. So we would ideally be able to apply some. I didn't say that so that you'd stop. Ideally, it's just making me feel a lot more warm here. We would be able to pull the component out without touching any other element on the page, and it's actually possible. And I did that by inspecting an article somewhere where this pattern was used, so it's totally useful to actually see how other people do things. So you can do that by pull the component out to the right using negative margin. These are magic numbers here. It depends on your layout and how much space you want between the elements. So these are numbers based on the layout that we have on the magazine. So you pull it out using margin right negative, fit it to the sidebar by giving it the width that you want, and then allow the rest of the content to wrap around it by giving it a float. Float right means that, okay, let the rest of the content flow wherever I was or wherever I'm not. The next thing is, instead of removing a component, we had to do something like this. So we had a component that is part of the main content, part of a specific column, but we wanted it to stretch to be the same width as the viewport. So the child is wider than the parent. There are many different ways to do this. No, actually 2 different ways to do this. But what works here, in our case, was we set the width to 98% of the viewport, because it's not really 100%. There's this tiny little space on each side. Position relative, and then move it to the left and to the right, and then margin left back. So you are pushing, the element is 100% width, and then you're pushing it by 50% to the left, okay, and then you're pulling it back. I don't even know how to visualize that. I should have created an interactive demo for this, okay. And this is how you do it. Now, in this example here, you see the book is cut from the bottom. This is part of the design here. So it overflows the black section from the top and should be doing it from the bottom as well. But ideally, we would be able to cut the overflow only from one side using overflow bottom, for example, or right or left, but we don't have that in CSS. So you can fake one side overflow hidden by using CSS Clip Path. So what I have a rectangle, okay, and it's cutting the black container from the bottom to fake that. And if a browser does not support CSS Clip Path, which again is IE and Edge, they will get this, which is a very decent fallback. And you can learn all about full width containers. There are multiple ways to do it, and I think that both they all work, but the best one is using viewport units. But there's one thing you should be careful of when you use viewport units. On iOS, I think on Safari iOS, using viewport units for the book panel I showed caused unwanted horizontal scroll bar on the body element. The reason for that is the viewport height and width is larger than the width and the height of the visual area. So what Safari iOS does, I think it also happened in Firefox and Firefox OS, but that one got discontinued. So what iOS does, instead of taking the visual part of the viewport, which is what you want, and using that value as the width, it counts in the width of the scroll bar as well. So you're going to end up with viewport plus scroll bar, and you're going to try to fit that inside of the viewport. You can't, so you get that overflow, horizontal overflow in the body. You can get over that by using overflow X hidden. I don't think I can go over the rest of the sections. Okay, maybe 5 minutes. So we did a few component level enhancements. This is actually the last section. So we did over a few of component level enhancements using Flexbox. I don't usually use Flexbox for page layouts. I don't have a specific reason to. I just prefer using it as an enhancement for now on a component level. So in the article, again, this is how the article starts on desktop. We have author and then title. But how we want it to be in a one-column layout is to be title and then author, because if you're on a small screen, you don't have a lot of estate. You want the user to be able to read the title first before they read the author information. So using Flexbox, if you remember from the previous layout demo, I mentioned that I wrapped the title and the author into one container. So you use display flex on the container. Display flex column is the direction, because otherwise they would stack horizontally. We want them to stack vertically. And then you go to the title and you give that an order -1, which pulls it back up so that it's the first element in the order. In the DOM, it's still the same. So if a browser does not support Flexbox, the user is still going to see the author first and then the title. If it does, as an enhancement, you're going to get this result here. Another thing where we used Flexbox was we have this add in the grid, and ideally, it's the 4th element in the DOM, so I started desktop first in this case. Ideally, we would be able to, as the screen resizes, we want the add to remain on the top right corner of the grid. We don't want it to be pushed down, because it's an add, it should always be prominent. So as you resize it, it remains there. Now, this is also done using the order property in Flexbox. So we have the container of all of the grids gets, again, display. Oh, no, this is actually for another thing. All of these items here, they have the same height. So this is just a prototype. So the content is exactly the same for each one. But in reality, the excerpts are different, the titles are different. So you're going to end up with items that are higher, longer than others. So in order to make sure that the grid was still perfect, sort of, and they all had the same height, you tell the browser you give display flex and flex wrap so that the items wrap, otherwise they would just be one row on the container, and then for each item you tell it display flex, which causes it to stretch, and then flex direction column so that the contents of that element do not change. And then using order, we can upgrade the position, we change the position of the add in the grid so that it is always positioned at the top right. So by default, the order of every single element in a Flexbox container is 0. Okay? If you start changing the order number, that's when you start shuffling elements visually. So on mobile, for example, we wanted the add to be the first thing on the list. So in order to do that, you keep the order 0 on the add, and then you give order 1, 2, 3, and then 4 for the rest of them. This means that the order is going to be there, the first one, and then the others are going to be 1, 2, 3. So this is how you do it. The first element in the grid gets order 1, as you saw. The second element 2, third element 3, fourth element, which is the add, gets order 4, and then n+5, nth of type n+5 means all items starting from the 5th item, so basically the rest of them. They get the order number 4. Now, one of the questions, I'll get to that later, okay. When we have 2 columns, we wanted the add to be the second one in the grid, because it was 2 columns, and we wanted it to be number 2. So you give order number 1 to the first one, order number 2 to the add, and then 3 to the second one, 4 to the third one, and then 5 to the rest. This is, again, the code. If you have 3, you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. And then in the 4th case, it's just, you get the regular order that you have. Now, in Smashing Conf, one of the attendees asked me, why didn't you keep the default order on all of the elements and give the add, for example, order 1 when you want it to be the first element? Now, the reason is, if you have order 0 on everything and you give it order 1, it's going to be pushed to be the last element because you have 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 1. That doesn't work. So in order to get the order that I wanted, I had to change it for all of them. This is another section. I'm going to skip over this. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. I would need like 10 minutes or 5 minutes to go over this, so. Wait, it's not skipping. It should be skipping. Okay. Well, there is a thank you slide somewhere. So thank you very much.